Again, this paper very much reflects the absolute beginnings of a work in progress, and I hope it can still be generative. And I'm thinking through how to be accountable in this work, as well as how and what to be thinking with in this work. So I very much welcome and appreciate all forms of feedback and critique. Okay. Since moving to Ohlone lands, I've had the opportunity to hear Chochenyo and Karkin Ohlone activist Karina Gold speak at numerous political rallies and events about the containment of what she estimates to be 8,000 exhumed Ohlone bodies being held in a basement beneath a swimming pool at the University of California, Berkeley. UC Berkeley holds one of the largest collections of exhumed bodies and human remains outside of a cemetery as part of the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology. From what I understand, the Hearst Museum houses a total of 10,000 to 12,000 Native human remains, which are kept in filing cabinets underneath the Hearst Gymnasium swimming pool. Despite the passing of the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, UC Berkeley has not had to legally return these bodies to the Ohlone. One reason for this is that as the Ohlone are not federally recognized, the state does not recognize any legal claim to a land base and thus no land within which the bodies could be legally reburied. Museums and researchers have several opportunities throughout NAGPRA to claim a right to possession, as well as the ability to claim that the remains are necessary for scientific study, particularly in cases where a group does not have federal recognition. Additionally, to prove cultural affiliation, the standards required to, quote, reasonably trace historical or prehistorical relationship of shared group identity, end quote, are left to the judgment of the museums and federal authority. NAGPRA law states that it does not intend to limit the general repatriation authority of federal agencies and museums. Thus, authority remains in the hands of the U.S. government and institutions. NAGPRA law still upholds and facilitates settler colonial ideologies, prioritizing the pursuit of scientific knowledge for the purposes of settler accumulation. NAGPRA is facilitated by the settler state, necessitating the dispossession of Native lands and the elimination of Native life. As Andrea Smith has discussed, a settler logic of elimination is one in which Native peoples are perceived to always already be dead or disappearing. Researchers exploit value from these bodies as they are used to extract scientific knowledge from which institutions accumulate wealth. Museums and research laboratories participate in a carceral project that seeks to contain Native bodies and Native pasts within settler imaginaries and to render these bodies as objects and property of scientific research. Bodies are contained indefinitely within the museum space. They are denied and suspended from the right to burial, foreclosing on the potential of alternate meanings and relationships with death. In this paper, I tentatively think with the concept of indefinite detention to see what it might reveal about the carceral logics and settler colonial containment strategies at work in the massive hoarding of posthumous Native bodies at UC Berkeley and within other institutional collections. Thinking of museum containment as indefinite detention reveals one aspect of a settler colonial carceral strategy which attempts to capture Native bodies within settler fantasies and contain them as objects of settler desire within a historical imaginary of, to use Philip Deloria's term, Indianness, cohering settler national reproductivity. Looking at the university as a site of settler colonial accumulation and reproduction, I consider how the university employs carceral methods in order to extract academic value through material devaluation and racializing technologies. This connection that I'm beginning to think through brings up questions about the population management functions of the university and of the museum. Some questions I'm thinking with in my writing are, how does this carceral project spatially enforce settler definitions of life and death onto bodies in place? How does the systemic excavation of racialized dead and rendering of burial sites into either scientific resource, waste site, or non-site mediate economic ideologies of extractive capital and racializing technologies of social death? How does the surveillance and desecration of Native grave sites attempt to enforce and restrict possible relationships with land while informing other surveilling technologies that structure and manage realms of life and death? By providing a short framing of the historical context of archaeological excavation and museum containment in juxtaposition with a brief reading of the state power asserted in indefinite detention, I will consider how practices of containment and value extraction from Native bodies within research spaces asserts a particular form of colonial surveillance and facilitates relationships of indebtedness reproducing the settler state. I think with Joanne Barker's work to understand the relationship between extractive capital and effective surplus value that researchers accumulate in their continued containment of these bodies, by thinking with Achille Mbembe's work on necropolitics and the spatial violence of colonial occupation, I consider what kinds of relationships colonial violence mediates temporally and spatially with death realms. The containment of Native corpses through archaeological excavation has been foundational to asserting U.S. settler place claims over Native lands. Museums have served as the holding spaces for exhumed bodies and objects, where displays have worked to ascribe a dominant settler historical narrative onto the past and onto place. The museum and university, as twinned colonial institutions of knowledge production, ascribe settler narratives onto bodies and objects and assert settler place claim as legitimate. By using stolen skulls to develop theories of eugenics science and white supremacy, settlers sought to legitimize colonization by scientifically proving that Native peoples were prehistoric and thus, in the words of Trope and Echo Hawk, doomed to extinction. The pursuit of Western research and knowledge formation is inseparable from genocidal settler histories seeking dispossession of Native lands and elimination of Native life. The collecting and unearthing of Native bodies was written into settler law with the Antiquities Act of 1906. It allowed for Native corpses to be unearthed and put on display in national museums. According to Jack Trope and Walter Echo Hawk, it, quote, defined dead Indians interred on federal lands as archaeological resources and converted these dead persons into federal property, end quote. This wrote into law a mandated incarceration of exhumed Native corpses into colonial institutions, enforcing a federal containment strategy of Native-place relationship. In the museum, hoarded bodies may be held indefinitely, suspended from rest and burial. In thinking with the term indefinite detention, which has been popularized in the U.S.'s ideological and military war against terrorism, what does the use of this term, if anything, reveal about the university and museum's carceral practices? And does it do anything to understandings of settler desire as a form and force of seemingly endless terror? In the post-9/11 United States, indefinite detention occurs in the context of a perceived security alert or national emergency in which the law is suspended and officials are granted ultimate authority to decide who will be detained indefinitely or not. In Judith Butler's Precarious Life, Butler thinks together governmentality and sovereignty to understand how power is exercised in the form of indefinite detention, writing that, quote, sovereignty becomes that instrument of power by which law is either used tactically or suspended. Populations are monitored, detained, regulated, inspected, interrogated, rendered uniform in their actions, fully ritualized and exposed to control and regulation in their daily lives. Butler shows how the U.S. government can protract an indefinite state of emergency and how certain forms of war are then a permanent part of the state apparatus. Thus, lawless power is extended indefinitely. Settler colonialism, I would argue, can then be understood as an indefinite form of war in which ongoing dispossession and population management are necessary to sustain claim of territories. Racialized populations are managed, contained, surveilled, and suspended of rights selectively in order to reproduce settler colonial claim. As Native grave sites are not recognized by the settler state as legitimate spaces of burial or granted rights of the dead, Native human remains are contained in a state of exploitation, detained indefinitely as objects of extractive value. However, as the relationship researchers perceive themselves to hold with Native human remains as one of caretaking and study, what does this reveal about the carceral qualities of settler desire? Across the Bay Area, Native bodies continue to be unearthed and extracted from grave sites during construction projects. The ongoing construction and development of UC Berkeley has involved countless excavations and desecrations of Ohlone burial sites, from which the bodies are typically put into the Hearst basement. Some professors at UC Berkeley have taken bones from beneath the Hearst swimming pool for use in their lectures, and in a recent case, a scientist was allowed to take Ohlone bones and crush them up for use in scientific study. When interviewed about the possibility of returning the bodies, some UC Berkeley archaeologists, quote, find it difficult to accept the reburial of bones from their collections, given that their specimens might provide insights into human history, end quote. These bodies in death are exploited for the purposes of extracting value in the form of scientific knowledge production, ensuring settler futures and foreclosing on Native ones. Museums position themselves as caretakers of Native bodies. UC Berkeley archaeologist and Professor Tim White says of the Ohlone bodies, quote, "Had they not been recovered and curated and placed in a museum, they would have been lost forever for everybody," end quote. White said he supports NAGPRA and, quote, "sees it as an opportunity to persuade tribes to let the museum continue caring for tribal objects," end quote. By objects, he is also referring to the bodies. Researchers attempt to convince Native communities that they need the museums to properly care for these bodies and sacred objects, positioning themselves as paternal caretakers. Through museum caretaking, Native bodies in death are contained into relationships of debt. As payment for the caretaking, value may be extracted from bodies. Thus, settler lives continue to accumulate upon Native bodies in their very state of death. In a Los Angeles Times article, UC Berkeley's described the containment site at UC Berkeley as, quote, "Many bones are kept in plastic bags. A few are wrapped in old newspapers. Soil still clings to some. To maximize storage space, most skulls are kept in one set of drawers and the skeletons in another," end quote. A carceral logic informs the shoving of skulls into one old cabinet, skeletons in another, for maximum storage space. What could have been the forgotten underbelly of a swimming pool is now utilized as a detention center for the dead. Thinking with Grace Hong's work, the dismemberment of bodies, skulls in one cabinet, skeletons in the other, means not only a severing of physical bodies, but also a severing of death from comprehensible definition. Research institutions enforce restrictions, or rather forecloses on possibilities of death meanings. In Necropolitics, Achille Mbembe describes the spatialization of surveillance under colonial occupation, writing that the airspace and ground are severed from one another. Quote, "The ground itself is divided between its crust and the subterranean. Colonial occupation is also dictated by the very nature of the terrain and its topographical variation. The underground as well as the airspace are transformed into conflict zones," end quote. How can archaeological excavation then be understood as a colonizing panoptic gaze into the soil itself, surveilling and containing bodies in death, policing boundaries between living and dead, land and body? Excavation seeks to map colonial occupation into the ground, to remove and root out Native presence. Often when museums do return bodies and sacred objects, they are severely poisonous due to preservation chemicals. Remains are returned permeated with colonial possession, physically contaminating connections to the past and making the present toxic. By physically extracting racialized dead from place, this enforces a suffocation of place meaning, in which meanings of life and death are surveilled and contained. This reproduces the idea of land as lifeless resource to be settled, parceled, sold, developed, and exploited. Severing of land from body, of life from death, attempts to spatially and temporally fix racialized bodies. And I'd like to continue this work to think through how this colonial carceral project informs and allows for other racializing technologies of surveillance, policing, and incarceration. And that's all I've got.
Great, so we have some time for some questions if folks have any.
Of these anthropologists or these social scientists, what is the racial background of these scientists?
Of the researchers?
Yeah.
I have not actually done a lot of field work or really gotten to know how that space is conducted, what the protocol in that space is, who's in those spaces, but from the article that what I'm learning about the process of identifying bones, working with bones, repatriation, there's a lot going on that I don't know very much about, but based on the information that I do have, like the quotations I read from the particular researchers, I assume to be white male professors. Is that answering your question a little bit?
No, I'm just wondering, demographically, because you said that you're interested in race and racialization, that also means that you would have to understand it from the perspective of people who are racializing these objects. So who are they? What are their backgrounds? Why are they interested in
Right.
talking about bodies as objects, because that's a very racial way of thinking in and of itself. So I'm just wondering how is that you came to that conclusion that this is a process of racialization.
In that in that production of being able to render certain dead bodies as being able to legitimately be in a research space, as that process of where like an argument to where a right to burial and a right to rest is not seen as being as legitimate as the use of certain bodies to be to be used for the production of scientific knowledge, and I think that is very racialized in how. That's I don't know. There's a lot of hands. Yeah.
So I sit on the NAGPRA committee at UCLA, right? And I think it's important to think about the structures of the UC system, because basically Tim White and Behringer, the UC Davis, have held up the return of remains across the UCs, right? Because things have to be initiated. So it makes less difference who they are racially, the scientists, and they're white. They're so colonial, awful people, white, and I'll say that publicly. They're awful. So there's a particular way that the NAGPRA, like UCLA, is working with in consultation with non-federally recognized tribes to work with federally recognized tribes who then have to claim the remains. It's incredibly complicated, but they then have to claim the remains for the return of the non-federally recognized remains. Now this all comes back to what this conference is about, which is land. And in order for remains in ancestors to be reclaimed, there has to be a place to put them, right? And that is where I highly encourage you to keep an eye out for what UCLA is going to be doing. I think it's public now, but I better shut up. But there has to be a way to do that then we can call them the moral, ethical aspects of each of the universities. Now Berkeley has held up the remains of the returns in general, except that enacted by the law. But that's because they've not allowed any Native people or tribal representation on their NAGPRA committee. So I always say this because I don't think people understand. It's not just about what the scientists want. If you can construct a committee that is full of people who have an ethical commitment, then you can get your universities or any of those. This is less a question, but this is like more a political plan and gesture. If you can have that tribal representation on those NAGPRA committees, you can change how those relationships exist. And I'll talk to you later more about some of the finer tuned points of NAGPRA and how it operates a little bit too, and give you the name of somebody who works in all of California and who's a major archaeologist in this particular work.
Thank you.
But there's a particular way I highly encourage, I don't know why the Chancellor of Berkeley hasn't actually reconstituted that particular committee. And that's all it would take. This is just one vote for the whole UC committee, and then it's the vote at the upper UC level. And we just won a big battle against them. I'm so excited.
So we probably have time for maybe one more quick question, and then I know that a lot of folks have things that they'd like to talk to Claire about, so perhaps we can transition that into lunchtime as well. I know I have a question for you. But yeah, so maybe one more quick question.
Oh yeah, just a comment. We got a call about maybe 5 years ago from the East Bay East Bay Municipal Utility District, and they called and said, oh, we have boxes and boxes of bones and skulls and objects that were from the Ohlone people, and a lot of them were like hairpins and tools, and so they had called different tribes in the area that were federally recognized, and they couldn't get any response because they were considered Ohlone remains. And so we did the reburial on East Bay Mud property. They gave us a place, and they said that this will never be disturbed. call the university and then ship them over to the university. They had been at East Bay Mud, Orinda at the office for 20 years. Some guys, you know, working at his desk, and he's got these boxes of bones right behind him. He said he just couldn't take it anymore, you know. And so we were able to reburial. We've done reburials in our group. We've done 4 reburials already for people who do not want to give those bones to the university, which is, I mean, every time someone calls us, we're like, oh my God, what's happening here? You know, we're doing reburials. And we do them, and we were able to